Ladies and gentlemen, if I could have your attention, please. My name is Mike Swetnam, and I'm the CEO of the Potomac Institute for Policy Studies, and it's my distinct honor and privilege to welcome you here today for a seminar on supply chain threat, the cyber issue that we've been discussing in and around Washington for quite some time. The Potomac Institute, for those of you who have not been here before, is a science and technology not-for-profit policy think tank, if you will, in the Washington, D.C. area that focuses on how science and technology affects our national security. For quite some time, we've been involved in the study of issues in and around what people call asymmetric threats, and most importantly, terrorism. This past year, Professor Yona Alexander and I released our second volume on Al-Qaeda about 11 years after our first volume on Al-Qaeda right before 9/11, and I'd like to call your attention to it. There are copies available here and, of course, available on the web and Amazon and all those good things. And I wanted to highlight it today because it's one of the gifts we're going to give to our panel members for taking the time out of their busy schedule to come join us today. At the very least, I can promise you a good sleep if you read it right when you go to bed. So, the second work that the Potomac Institute has been involved in over this past year is an effort with the Battelle Corporation to look at the cyber issue, in particular cyber doctrine. That volume, edited by Tim Sample and I, is in publication as we speak, but you have on your seats and available to all of you a short flyer that summarizes what's in that volume. It will be out shortly, and we'll of course make sure that copies are available to each one of you as they come out of the press. I'd like to note the Honorable Randy Fort sitting in the front row, who's one of the authors, chapter authors in this volume, and has contributed not just to the cyber discussion this year, but of course for more than a decade since the issue has hit some note. The Potomac Institute, as I mentioned before, is involved in the discussion of science and technology as it affects our national security. It's been our goal for the 18 years of our existence to help be a place where the discussion can be held in a forum that encourages the development of policy based upon good academic scholarship and input. Your participation today, not just in listening to the speakers, but interacting with them, taking away what they said, and publishing and being involved and contributing yourself to the issue, we think is of prime importance. It is only with the interaction of all of us combined that we could ever hope to address issues as thorny as that of the cyber issue in and around Washington, D.C. A quick note before I turn this over to our moderator today. I'm an electrical engineer, at least I was some 30 years ago. When I got a degree, it's probably not worth anything today. But the issue in electrical engineering was always a discussion between the hardware guys and the software guys. Who's really at fault for the fact that this is breaking or not working? And of course, the hardware guys always blamed the software guys, and the software guys always complained that they were having to do things to work around poor hardware design. Today, we have, I guess we're in our fifth, sixth, or seventh year of a formal federal program to address the cyber issue. We're probably in our second, going on third decade of recognizing that we have a cyber issue. And I will, from my perspective, tell you that we're doing a pretty fair job of addressing the potential threats from the software side of the coin, only to discover that, yes, there are hardware issues as well. Without addressing both sides of the equation, and they're very different. Software is transient, comes and goes, and will need responses on the order of milliseconds. Hardware stays around for a while, is hard to address, and is very expensive to address, and the issues in and around bad things in our hardware are far different than the issues in and around software. Only a complementary approach, I would contend, will help us really solve the issue of cyber threats. With that, let me turn the podium and this forum over to retired Rear Admiral Jamie Barnett, who will lead us through, I hope will be a very lively presentation and discussion of the issues surrounding cyber. I thank you all very much for coming, and I once again encourage you to be involved continuously in this issue. Your input is very important. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Mike. I'm Jamie Barnett. As Mike said, I'm the Senior Vice President of Potomac Institute for Policy Studies. So welcome and thanks for taking time out of your busy schedules to be here. And also our guests that are viewing this on C-SPAN and on the web, we really appreciate your presence and part of this discussion. And this is an august audience that we have here, and I know you're also here to hear this amazing panel of speakers, which we'll get to very quickly. I had the opportunity to address the supply chain problem, and particularly the communication supply chain, while I was chief of the Public Safety and Homeland Security Bureau. I got to work with some of the folks in the audience right here on that, and I appreciate your presence here. When I got here and started talking to our CEO, Mike Swetnam, and realized that the Potomac Institute has traditionally been involved in defense supply chain and other supply chain matters, this symposium seemed very appropriate and timely. And one of the major missions, as he mentioned, of Potomac Institute is to elevate the policy discussions on matters of critical importance to the nation. So I'm not going to speak today, or if I do, it will only be to fill in for Bobby Stempley, Deputy Assistant Secretary of Homeland Security, who unfortunately had to cancel at the last minute. I did have a short article that you will see on the front table there. It's printed, it's also on our website. But the supply chain threat is as much a matter of national security as is cybersecurity. It's actually part and parcel. And in some ways, it's as difficult, if not more difficult. And while work is ongoing in Washington to address this, the nation needs a fulsome discussion of how to approach this matter, what the real concerns are, even before we get to what the answers are. It must be recognized as a threat. It must be recognized that the status quo is not acceptable. The status quo is not even possible. It's not going to remain the same one way or the other. And we must recognize that the government interest in supply chain matters for private companies is a concern, especially for private companies. What is the proper role for government? What are the incentives that can be provided to industry? And the most important question, what will be effective? You have our agenda. We will have our keynote speaker, and I will then introduce each one of the panelists. We'll hold questions till after all have spoken, but then I do encourage you to ask questions. I'll have a few questions for them first, and then we'll open it up to the audience. We really encourage that. I would ask you to use the microphone. If you don't use the microphone, then it might be harder for our guests on the web and on C-SPAN to hear you. I am very pleased that this symposium is being co-hosted by our partners, National Security Partners, which provides outstanding service to the nation and our intelligence community. And with us today is the president of National Security Partners, who's going to introduce our keynote speaker. Brigadier General retired J.O. McFalls is the president of National Security Partners. As the first president of NSP, he is responsible for the overall operations and service delivery to the company's various federal communications customer. As program manager and lead consultant to the National Security Agency, he's provided a host of services. He has previously led the contract support for the Directorate of Planning and Performance by providing corporate vision, strategic planning, and performance metrics assistance for essential partners and really the nation's 17-member intelligence community. While on active duty in the United States Air Force, General McFalls served in many key senior assignments to include Director of Operations for the Air Training Command, Deputy Director of the Air Force Legislative Liaison, and Commander of the Air Force's largest F-15E unit, the 4th Tactical Fighter Wing. He has a Bachelor of Science in Aeronautical Engineering from the United States Air Force Academy. I think I've heard of them somewhere, don't they, out west someplace? And a Master's of Science in Aerospace Engineering from the University of Michigan. Would you welcome General J.O. McFalls?
Okay, I didn't know that part was happening because I have the easy part here. It's really an honor and a privilege to introduce our keynote speaker today, and for our company that Jamie was just talking about, the National Security Partners, to be affiliated and co-sponsor with this very prestigious and influential organization, the Potomac Institute for Policy Studies. As our tagline states here behind me, that we're difference makers. National Security Partners have been supporting many of the organizations that are represented in the room as I look around the audience here for several years. But today, Jamie said, say something nice about Dennis Bartko, who I've known and our team has supported for 5 years or so. So let me go with that. As the NSA Director's Special Assistant for Cyber, He leads the NSA Cyber Task Force. When General Alexander selected Dennis, he obviously knew the same things that I'm about to tell you, because Dennis started this organization way back in early 2007, and he still is the leader. And as you probably saw from when you signed up on the web to attend today's symposium, Dennis is perfect for this job. He's a technical expert, he's an electrical engineer, and a crypt analysis expert. In fact, he's a proud card-carrying member of what we affectionately and respectfully refer to as the crypto math mafia. That, and combined with his diverse experience serving on Capitol Hill with then Congressman Robert Ehrlich's legislative staff, followed by his tour with the private sector at Bell Atlantic, Verizon Communications, this makes him very well-rounded and diversified for this job. But even before that, those that really know him will remember his musical inclinations, playing drums for his high school rock and roll band, the Royal Flush. And when we get to some of the questions, you can ask what really that means. He actually had much longer hair than he has now. He's a martial arts black belt, a devoted model railroad enthusiast, and just an overall fascinating guy. But as you can see, I've been on the circuit a long time. And Dennis has got to be in the top 3 to 5 of the inspirational leaders with whom I've worked over my several careers. He's the epitome of all the great business leadership books that you may have read. So, and he's truly the level 5 leader that is described in Jim Collins' Good to Great book. And that's because it's not that he doesn't have an ego, but his ambition is first and foremost for his institution, his agency, and not himself. And he inspires all of his team to reflect that philosophy. Over the years, he's gained the respect within all portions of the federal government that deal with cybersecurity, and he's routinely sought after for his valued opinion on all things cyber. And that's why the Potomac Institute asked him to kick off this event. A humble, inspirational leader with the highest of integrity, technical expertise to understand the most complicated cybersecurity subjects, politically savvy to make his team sensitive to all the varied perspectives, and the ambition to directly support his agency, and a Ravens and Philadelphia Flyers fan. It doesn't get any better than this. Ladies and gentlemen, George Dennis Bartko.
Thank you for that kind and very generous introduction. And also thank you to Potomac Institute for the invitation to be here as part of this great panel and all of the folks that are here. As the director of NSA, General Alexander, also the commander of the United States Cyber Command, says, it takes a team to address the challenges and issues that our nation has in cybersecurity. No one individual department or agency or the government itself can address those challenges. It takes a team that includes the private sector, the government, our industry, our allies, and our citizens that all come together to address those challenges. So I think it's really appropriate that we're all together here today to have a dialogue on a really important issue, which is the supply chain challenge in the information and communications sector. And this threat is an important and complex issue for which there's no real simple solution. And it's going to take a team effort to address. Now, as I had the invitation to come today, I started thinking, what is it that I could actually contribute to a discussion with individuals across those sectors, either from being on the panel or from being in the audience here, that would be of value to help frame this discussion. And as I thought, inspiration really came over dinner with my wife. But we'll get back to that in a little bit. Because NSA is appropriately not an organization that either sets or makes policy. We execute our mission of signals intelligence and information assurance in a space which has become what we now call cyberspace. And it's from that experience and especially from the experience we've learned through our information assurance mission, that I hope to share and contribute some to this discussion that's being held here today. Specifically, what is this space? Why is it important? Are there a set of key attributes that we should consider as we're discussing solutions in the space? And if there are, what are the responses that we as a nation may want to consider in accordance with those? And who might be required to do it? So with your permission, I'm going to take that approach, and for just a couple of minutes, even though it might be very high level, it might be something that every one of you know, but often to start a discussion, it's important to start from the same context and basis. Our deputy director at NSA, Mr. Chris Inglis, often says to the answer of what is cyberspace, he gives this answer, that cyberspace is where our nation stores its treasure and its wealth. Our treasure being the intellectual property of our nation, created by all of us across all those different areas that we talked about, in our private sector, our industry, our academia, and beyond. And our wealth not being so much the money that we print or the coins that we mint, but the bits and databases that actually represent that. And this space that we call cyberspace actually has been good for everything that we care about as core values in our nation: our national security, our economic competitiveness, our public safety, and even civil liberties. But at the same time, we wouldn't be here having this discussion if, for all the good that the space has enabled and done, that there weren't also challenges or threats. And those threats come in a number of different directions, in a number of different ways. They come from sets of actors, some actors who are in that space who don't share the same values or approaches that we do in the space. It comes from various techniques and tools that could be used, some of which have become increasingly popular in our lexicon as a nation, from viruses to denial of service attacks and bots. But it also comes from a series of vectors being things that range from insider threats, threats that can be done over remote access through networks, and threats to our supply chain, which brings us here together today. And as we contemplate and think about the supply chain threat and the challenges in that domain, I would like to share 3 attributes that we at NSA believe that we have identified as part of our time and experience in this domain. There may be more, but these 3 are something that we use when we think about challenges that we face in order to determine if solutions probably are good solutions to the problems that we might have. The first attribute is convergence. That when you look at this space, that if perhaps there's any single attribute that's most important, it's the fact of convergence. Different things that were separate coming together to make one. In fact, cyberspace was created from separate elements that were converging over time, increasingly, that became this thing we call the internet and wider cyberspace. In fact, there might have been at least 3 levels of convergence that have been taking place. A convergence in the connections in this space, which were once separate depending on the media from which you might have been communicating, whether you were making a phone call or you were watching a video on TV or maybe trying to send some email or text message that is converged, which led to another level of convergence in the devices that we use. When we used to have to use separate devices to get access to the various types of communication links, now those devices were able to collapse and converge, so that now that many of us carry around smartphones, tablets, devices, they're essentially all devices that can handle all of those communication means in different form factors or shapes. And that's leading to another powerful convergence of how we can all gather and have discussions, not bounded by geography, which brings together much opportunity for wide-ranging international and across our nation discussions, right, and collaboration on activity. So we see convergence as an important and continuing aspect in the space. And if it is, in fact, one of the attributes of the space, then we believe that perhaps the appropriate response to convergence is integration. That all of us who are working in this space need to actually integrate our efforts to the greatest extent possible to bring together everything that our nation can to address these challenges. The second attribute is pretty simple. It's continual change. We know in this space that cyberspace is not going to be the same tomorrow as it is today. It's continually changing and evolving. And if, in fact, that's true, then our response, whatever it might be, needs to be highly agile. And in fact, it may cause us to think if our responses need to consider the use of change itself as an appropriate response to the challenge of the continual change in the space. The third is very important. It's that there's huge amounts of information in this space. And if there's huge amounts of information in this space of all different types and of all different types of media, it may seem most appropriate that our response should consider how we share information amongst and between ourselves in order to address the challenges in the space. Information sharing, therefore, we believe, is an appropriate response to the great amounts of information that are in that space. So if the space has these attributes with these required responses, there may be more, right? But these are ones that we think might be helpful as we have a discussion on threats in the space and responses to them, including the supply chain threat that we're discussing today. And that brings me back to something I said briefly as part of my opening. I said that inspiration came for this talk in part over dinner with my wife. And while we were eating dinner, I was thinking, what could it be that perhaps they could bring to this forum? The answer, in some point, was a thought that was sitting in front of me. Do you know that analogies are never perfect, and that one analogy never works in every other situation that you're trying to apply it to? But when you're faced with a complex challenge that's as important as a supply chain threat, it's as complex as the supply chain threat that's going to take a collective team effort to address, then looking at how other problems that might be somewhat similar were handled might also be instructive. So I was looking down at dinner. What was in front of me was food. And when you sit back and think, food that we have is something that each of us know that we need. I mean, it's essential, right? And that each of us trust that comes to us, right, in a way that's safe for us to consume for what we need. And in fact, there's a lot of great work that's done to try to work and ensure that food safety. And in fact, the food itself is becoming more internationally available and internationally distributed. So when you look at cyberspace, I'm not saying in any particular way that cyberspace has become as important to us as food. But depending on who you are and depending on what you do, it's feeling very much and increasingly important. And just like food, we're having an increasingly globally supplied cyberspace in the infrastructure that we depend upon. And similarly, for all of those who use cyberspace, it's somewhat challenging and somewhat to know whether or not that the cyberspace you're using is safe and secure and can be trusted. And so we have to often rely on others to help ensure that safety, security, and trust. And so, again, one analogy will never always fit, but even things that we would apply in that domain, such as understanding what the risks are, right? Taking action to try to address them and having plans that you could put in place if those risks actually come to pass are probably also appropriate things for us to dialogue and discuss as we talk about supply chain threat. So again, I thank for the opportunity to provide some, what I hope was useful framing discussion for the dialogue that's about to take place. I'm honored to be sitting on the panel with some people who are very thoughtful and have worked the policy in this issue across the board, some of which I've had the blessing to work for a number of years with. And I look forward to the dialogue and discussion because, again, in supply chain, a complex and important issue, the one that's going to defy a simple solution, it's going to be the diversity of thought that we all bring together to the table that will help make the answer to that solution real and possible. So I appreciate the opportunity and look forward to participating.
Dennis, thank you so much, and we appreciate your presence and thoughts here. So, we're also very pleased to have Brett Lambert with us today. He joined the Department of Defense in 2009 as the Deputy Assistant Secretary of Defense for Manufacturing and Industrial Base Policy. Mr. Lambert serves as the Principal Advisor to the Undersecretary for Defense for Acquisition, Technology, and Logistics on all matters relating to Defense Industrial Base. In 2011, he was awarded the Secretary of Defense Medal of Outstanding Public Service for his work in his current position. Prior to joining DoD, Mr. Lambert spent 20 years working on defense and defense intelligence firms. From 1989 until 2007, he held positions of increasing responsibility at DFI International, a national security consultancy that he built with the founder and assisted in selling in 2007. He served as the Executive Vice President and Managing Director during that period of time. And while at DFI, Mr. Lambert also led the company's work with first-tier defense firms, financial institutions, private equity organizations in merger and acquisition market advisory services. He attended graduate school at Nehru University in India, a Rotary Scholarship he received during his senior year at Kansas State University. He also worked for the journalists in the audience. He worked as an independent journalist in India, Pakistan, and Burma. Before his time in Asia, Mr. Lambert served in the political military group in the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Would you welcome Assistant Secretary of Defense Brett Lambert?
Thank you. I appreciate it. It's too easy. I can't go without saying you've given us food for thought. But thanks very much for having me. And I'm particularly pleased to be here at the Potomac Institute, both in the private sector and more so actually since I joined the government about 3 years ago. I've come to rely on the insights and the papers and the products from the Potomac Institute as really a source for unbiased, forward-leaning thinking on a wide variety of technology issues that often confound us, certainly inside the building. And I don't think they get the daily recognition they deserve, but if it's any consolation, I try to steal from your products as often as possible because they do offer a tremendous amount of insight. And I also want to thank you for the loan of Steve Linder, who's here today, who's in our office working on a number of manufacturing issues, particularly as they relate to the supply chain. For this part of it, before we get to the Q&A, I also would like to stand back a little bit and try to frame the specific threat of cyber in a larger context of the overall industrial base supply chain that we face. And I look around the room, and I know I've spoken to many of you one-on-one about some of these tough challenges we face in the supply chain. So hopefully what I'm going to say today publicly won't differ from what I've told you privately. Let me start at the very beginning with an attempt to define the defense industrial base supply chain. It's a term which is often used both inside and outside of government, but rarely in a way that accurately depicts the reality on the ground. The defense industrial base is comprised of an extremely diverse set of companies that provide both products and services, directly and indirectly, to the national security agencies, including the military. References to the defense industrial base that imply some monolithic entity are not, frankly, analytically useful. The defense industrial base includes companies of all shapes and sizes, resourced from around the globe, from some of the world's largest public companies to sole proprietorships to garage startups. Some companies deal directly with the federal government, while the vast majority of suppliers, subcontractors, and providers are in a value chain that leads to those prime contractors many times 10 or 15 times removed. Companies at any tier and of any size offer critical or hard-to-make products that ultimately lead to the systems used by our warfighters. Some products and services are sold by companies in the defense industrial base that are truly unique to the defense applications. But most have substantial levels of non-defense demand, or even sold exclusively on commercial terms, such that the supplier may not even know that their product is ultimately used in a military system. And likewise, the department may not know it depends primarily on a commercial component. Finally, while the pace of innovation is extremely rapid in some segments across the defense industrial base, such as IT, other segments are based on very mature technologies where dynamic innovation is less important to the department. In short, there's no single defense industrial base. There is a defense market that's serviced by a diverse selection of companies which span and often reflect the greater global economy for goods and services. I liken it to the Mall of the Americas, where you have anchor stores and big names that you recognize the big names in aerospace and defense, but you have a few stores that you might recognize as national chains. And then you have literally hundreds of other stores that when you walk by, you think to yourself, who the hell would buy from them? The fact is we do. We buy everything. We buy everything from ships to shoestrings, and from services, we buy everything from mowing lawns to the highest-end cybersecurity analysis. And what's important about this analogy is that even the stores that aren't familiar to most, in fact, the entire mall represents just a small portion of the overall supply chain that provides the components and software necessary to stock the shelves of every single component and weapon system we field. The U.S. military's superior operational capabilities are enabled by this diverse base. And for decades, the United States has commanded a decisive lead in the quality and quantity of the defense-related research and engineering conducted globally, and in the military capabilities of the products that flow from this work. However, the advantages that have enabled American preeminence in defense technology are frankly not a birthright. And the key element of that base are necessary to ensure U.S. dominance on future battlefields must be sustained and nurtured. The U.S. defense industrial base supply chain is critical to equipping our military with superior capabilities, and a strong, technologically vibrant, and frankly financially successful supply chain all the way down is therefore in the national interest. There's one more important truth we have to recognize. At the end of the day, despite spending over $1 billion a day, we in the Pentagon don't actually build anything. We rely on our industrial supply chain to develop, build, and ultimately maintain the goods and services upon which our warfighters' lives depend, as well as the lives of the citizens they defend. So with that in mind, let me turn to the three currents I see coursing through the changing industrial base supply chain. Simply put, our base is more global, it's more commercial, and it's more financially complex. The reality is truer today than it was yesterday, and it will be truer tomorrow than it is today. The defense industry and the suppliers that it is made up of are constantly changing, constantly adapting to the department requirements and to the conditions set forth in the commercial marketplace. This evolution in the base brings with it new and difficult challenges, and it begs for a flexible, adaptive approach to the ever-changing reality on the ground. Outdated constructs of a static or stale industrial base, where the U.S. government could dictate certain assurances or impose inflexible rules on our suppliers, must give way to the facts on the ground that our base is no longer a single monolithic entity. Any industrial-based supply chain policy must take these facts into account in developing a much more sophisticated and nuanced view of our base than has traditionally been the case. Overall, the goods and services the department relies upon reach far deeper into the overall global economy than most in the department appreciate. While there are unique items produced solely for us, these items themselves often rely upon a complex and integrated supply chain of product providers which, if restricted or compromised at the second, third, fourth, or even 10th tier, would jeopardize even the seemingly pure industrial player's ability to support the warfighter on an ongoing basis. So let's start with the first reality, which is our base is more global, and we must recognize the implications of this increasingly global marketplace in which we operate. More and more, the advanced goods and services upon which we rely are produced by firms that were not founded in the United States. Also challenging is that much of our supply chain, particularly at the lower tiers and in information technology, are provided by firms from countries that are not our closest allies. Now, buying from a more global environment offers many benefits. It increases competition and thus reduces costs. It allows for the introduction of new technologies and concepts. It often supports coalition warfighting efforts, or at least makes them less difficult to execute. And we can benefit from the lessons learned and efficiencies gained from other nations whose militaries have faced difficult financial circumstances and were forced to drive home their own, quote, better buying power initiatives. Moreover, globalization, frankly, is not an option. It's a reality. But while buying from a more global environment offers many benefits to the department, we must be aware of the significant risks. These include, but are not limited to, the main reason we're all here today: the threat of counterfeit or inferior parts entering the supply chain, the potential for undue reliance on components whose origin or actual configuration may not be fully understood, as well as the risk of leaked intellectual property to foreign businesses and governments. When it comes to articulating the real-world risks of a failure policy on this subject, particularly as it relates to cyberspace, one look no further than the panel that's here with me today to give you a sense of the potential devastating consequences. The second key feature of the modern industrial base, and linked to the one I just described, is that increasingly many of our segments vital to defense are commercial in nature, or rely upon commercially designed components. This is a trend the department has frankly been more willing to recognize in policy than in practice. I'd hazard a guess that 25 years ago, nearly 70% of the goods and services the department procured were developed and produced exclusively for the department. Today, I would suggest that the ratio has reversed, with roughly 70% of the goods and services now either produced for commercial consumption or originally developed with commercial applications in mind, as well as a largely commercial-based supply chain. This is a very difficult concept for many in our business to get their arms around. Frankly, the department is much more comfortable being the dog, not the tail of a market. This attitude, frankly, is not helpful when we discuss the various ways to understand or track our supply chain. Simply put, the old standby remedy to most supply chain concerns of mandate it simply won't work in the modern global and commercial environment. Yet we must adjust to deal with the new reality. And as I've stated before, despite our financial resources, we in the department build little. Our industrial base does, both military and commercial. And the department simply can't afford to dominate or prop up every important domestic industry upon which we rely all the way through the supply chain. It's simply not economically feasible or strategically desirable. Trusted foundries are, well, I'm not even going to get started with that, so maybe in the Q&A. The DoD will certainly continue to rely and support niche elements of the industrial base supply chain that's critical to our national security. But we must better understand precisely what these critical elements of the base are. Then buying from commercial firms, secure commercial firms, when warranted and prudent, ultimately allows us to save money to dedicate in supporting those defense-unique items and supply chains that will never find a commercial marketplace. But incorporating commercial products into the defense arsenal is not without its own set of challenges. Incorporating more commercial firms through the supply chain means breaking down many of the bureaucratic barriers to entry which still exist in the department. And I recognize that top managers of commercial companies are often put off, particularly in the telecommunications market, by the political and government-induced complexities of working with the department as both a regulator and a buyer. Believe me, this occupies a lot of my time. I try to remind these executives in, again, primarily telecommunications companies, that while Uncle Sam may not be your favorite uncle, he is by far the single richest one you will ever know, even in these trying fiscal times. To encourage more commercial participation, the department is striving to incorporate more commercial practices and products into our processes whenever possible, and adopting commercial standards as a means of securing the supply chain. But we must do a better job of not simply accepting the benefits without fully understanding, appreciating, and mitigating the risks of such an approach, not just to our end products, but throughout the entire supply chain. Moreover, we must understand the dichotomy of this approach and the hazards associated with it. On the one hand, the key attribute allows for a steady long-term supply base and supply chain are the high barriers to entry our market sometimes imposes. As we lower those barriers for all the right commercial and technological reasons, such as ease in entry and exit, access to more advanced technology, and increased competition, we do so at the risk of disrupting that which has made some of our industry unique and opens us up to those manufacturers and supply chains who have shorter-term interest for which the department may be justifiably concerned. The third trend, which I won't spend time on today at our industrial base, but I'd at least like to highlight, is the growing complexity and importance of the financial sector that supports the entire supply chain, again, from ships to shoestrings. The financial community has a vital and often overlooked role in playing to ensure the health and viability of the entire supply chain. From the small technology startups which seek venture funding to pursue transformational products and systems, to the debt markets which support our base through access to capital as programs mature and evolve, the entire supply chain simply could not survive without access to capital on a competitive basis. And as is the case with our supply chain generally, the financial sector is becoming more complex, more global, and more problematic by the day. The common theme running through all of these trends is the ever-increasing complexity of our base and our supply chain. And those are the facts on the ground. The problem is not getting easier. In fact, it's becoming more complex by the day. And I look forward to getting the answers to take back with me to the department during our discussion.
Great.
Brett, thank you so much. I'm sorry that Roberta, Bobby Stempley was not able to be with us today, and I might mention to you that this is not the only one of these types of symposia that we're going to have. We kind of concentrated on government this time. Next time we may have more industry, but maybe Bobby Stempley can join us at that one, and you can look forward to those in the future. Right now, we're so pleased to have Melissa Hathaway with us, president of Hathaway Global Strategies, someone who was among a number of people who came to advise me when I was at the FCC on cybersecurity and other matters. Her company now brings a multidisciplinary, multi-institutional perspective to strategic consulting and strategic formulation of public and private sector clients, for her clients there. And she's got an eye-watering resume. I'm going to only mention a few things from it that I understand. She's been on the board of directors of the East-West Institute, a member of the Council of Experts for the Global Cybersecurity Center in Italy, a member of the Strategic Advisory Board of the Advanced Cybersecurity Center in Boston. It goes on and on like that. Ms. Hathaway also provides strategic advice to the United States government here and throughout the world, Interpol, numerous other governments. She's worked in participating and contributing to a joint MIT-Harvard Project Minerva, developing methods to measure, model, interpret, and analyze challenges and responses in cyberspace. She's also a regular guest lecturer at both of those universities. From 2009 to, February 2009 to August 2009, Ms. Hathaway served in the Obama administration as acting senior director for cyberspace on the National Security Council. In that capacity, she assembled a team of experienced government cyber experts to conduct the 60-day review of cyberspace policy review. In May 2009, the President presented the elegant blueprint, she said, of the cyberspace, and under Ms. Hathaway's leadership of conducting the review, it was tremendous work. She was continued to do things. She's worked in the Bush administration for many things, a recognized expert in this world, and so we are very pleased to have with us, and please welcome Melissa Hathaway.
Thank you, Jamie, and I'm very honored to be here at the Potomac Institute, and Mike, thank you for your leadership in this particular area. The Institute is really known for translating complex technology issues into more simple terms and for the policymakers, and the Potomac Institute was a strong partner while I was working in the Bush administration to help us have a neutral ground, to have the conversation about cybersecurity and the needs of the nation, and helping us with the forward-looking policy perspective. So thank you again for hosting this today. And I'm not sure how I can follow Dennis and Brett because they were amazing. And so I'm going to take a little bit of a different perspective and talk about the supply chain from maybe historical and then to today. And I'm hoping it's going to complement my other two esteemed colleagues. So I'm going to start with just a little bit of history. I'm going to really fast forward it. Back in 1969 in October, we're almost not too many days away from the anniversary of the very first transmission of the internet, and October 29th, 1969. And that was really the beginning of the opening of a lot of the conversation that we're having today, the dependence on information communications technology, the dependence that we have on all of our essential services on the internet today. And it became more and more of a reality as we developed and enhanced technology. In 1985, as Steve Crocker would tell you, who's in the audience, we opened up and created the .com domain and other top-level domains, and the internet became a platform for e-commerce and essential services in 1985. And then after that, we had the World Wide Web, and we allowed easier search and for information, and enabling more and more information communication technology innovation. In the coming years, our governments embraced that ICT dividend for the hope of the economic growth and productivity that it enabled, and for the innovation agenda that it enabled. And we started to put more and more of our essential services onto the backbone of the internet. Today, we have e-banking and e-commerce all riding on the internet. We're moving toward a future of having our energy distribution on a smart grid that's connected to the internet. We're moving to a generation of next generation aviation and air traffic control that's controlled by the internet and over the internet. And so we've moved so much of our essential services onto the internet, then one has to ask, is that what it was designed for, and is it secure for what we need it for in the future? This brings about three tensions. I'm gonna try to stick to threes. So three tensions that we're seeing in the policy world, and then three tensions that we've seen in the technology world. The first is we're seeing a tension of the need from an economic policy to stimulate the economy versus the demands for national security. ICT and the economic growth that ICT and the internet promises our countries is measured nearly at 4% GDP growth. And that's a small estimation right now, and that's what the G20 countries are expecting. Developing nations are expecting the ICT and the e-economy to contribute to as much as 10% of the GDP growth. And so we're going to continue to embrace the internet and the e-economy and ICT in order to drive that growth, whether it's job growth, productivity growth, efficiency. And in the United States, we expect it to lead to as much as 40% of the productivity by adopting that ICT technology and embedding the next generation technologies into our infrastructures and our enterprises. The second tension, then, as a evolution from the first, and that's where we're talking about infrastructure modernization versus critical infrastructure protection. Infrastructure modernization is where we're actually moving more and more of these essential services to the internet-based backbone, whether it's smart grid, or whether it's water distribution, whether it's oil and gas distribution, whether it's the aviation system. Most of our essential services are embracing and embedding the next generation technologies into those infrastructures. On the other side, though, from a policy perspective, we're looking for how do we ensure the critical infrastructure protection so that we can, in fact, deliver those essential services, that they're not vulnerable to attack coming through the internet or over and through the supply chain. And how do you manage those risks? And those risks start to be coming into standards, minimum standards of care, and the discussion that we're talking that is happening all around the world of should we regulate these infrastructures and these businesses more to deliver a minimum standard of care because of the vulnerabilities that have been adopted through the ICT dividend. The third tension from a technology and policy perspective then comes down to who's in charge. Is it public sector or is it the private sector? The public sector is here to actually contribute to public safety, economic well-being, and overall national sovereignty or national security. They are responsible, the government is responsible for ensuring that we have those essential services delivered to us. But at the end of the day, it's all about the private sector. The private sector designs, builds, delivers, and operates all of those infrastructures. And if in the event that there was a problem, the private sector is responsible for the actual recovery and restoration of that infrastructure. So then comes the policy debate. We have both are in charge. One is responsible for assuring citizen safety and those essential services, and the other is responsible for really delivering it. So how do you actually then make the policy a reality? And I'm going to talk to those as far as we look at, is we need a mix of policy levers and market levers, and we need to take a broad look at what that is to ensure our competitiveness in this global environment. And I can talk to the mix of market levers that we need. So from there, that history, I'm going to talk a little bit about the supply chain and how this comes together. So supply chain management is about the movement of raw materials into an organization, the internal processing of those materials into finished goods, and the distribution of finished goods to the end customer. Again, 3 processes. Supply chain professionals, and those of us who have to work with that, we design and manage the product, the information, and the financial flows that all businesses run on today. Again, another 3. Today, companies worldwide are leveraging those supply chains, that global supply chain, and those mix of processes and procedures to gain competitive advantage. The competitive advantage might be the raw material actually exists in another country. The competitive advantage might be the price point for labor is cheaper in another country. And the advantage could be that the fact that the product or the integration of that is easier to assemble and to integrate in another country because of their environmental laws or other laws are more supportive of the needs of their businesses and to deliver product to market. So with that, then we are looking at another set of tensions. We are expecting the global supply chain to be available at all times, to enable, from an ICT perspective, our confidentiality of our businesses, and then we're demanding that those products maintain their integrity. So it's no mistake that I'm using the confidentiality, integrity, and availability of information assurance, because that's in many ways what we're talking about of the 3 tenets of information assurance, where we're now worried about the integrity of the products coming into our global supply chain that might compromise the businesses, our confidentiality, and or the overall availability of those essential services of all of those essential services and businesses. So the globalization of IT hardware and software, and I must point out that hardware is really a lot of software behind the actual stuff, is that the products are being built, delivered, maintained, upgraded all around the world, and they are vulnerable to opponents who wish it harm. The global commercial supply chain provides adversaries, or these opponents, with greater opportunities to manipulate the product from design through its entire product life cycle. And adversaries that may have access to those particular networks, or they're designed to have access, wanting access, to whatever part of the target is target-rich environment. And so we need to recognize that there's a whole process involved. Many of the times when we're talking about supply chain risk management, we're talking about and thinking about that once we got that product to market, and now how do we secure it? But there's a whole evolution of roles and responsibilities of that product life cycle and supply chain. The design. We can have vetted providers that are using industry-leading best practices. Sometimes that's what we're talking about. It goes to Brett's point of the anchor tenets. We talk about manufacturing, and the manufacturing should employ service level agreements that are related to quality and security. And sometimes we talk about it must be indigenously manufactured. Many countries around the world are talking about that. And when and if we discuss about a trusted foundry. That's when people are talking about trusted foundries or manufactured within the United States or elsewhere. Many countries right now are talking about we must have an indigenous build. Well, what does that mean exactly? We got to integrate it. We're going to integrate by limiting perhaps online software installations and thoroughly vet updates. These are processes that we need to have in place as the integration. But you're going to have integration of multiple components and then multiple components that are integrated into an end product. Are you going to look at the integration that's going to happen in each one of those assembled areas? We have a Dell computer over here, and we have a camera, and we have all of these little, I'm sure we've got a tablet up here. I can tell you that each one of those elements were probably designed in multiple countries. They were most likely manufactured, the components, in multiple countries. They were integrated, the components, in multiple countries, and that becomes the particular product. Any one of these tablets or computers or smartphones that you have is likely has touched more than 40 countries along the way. Is it really possible to talk about an indigenous build and an indigenous manufacturing then, and as we're managing the risk? The distribution. We need to think about secure distribution channels, but again, it's distribution of all of those multiple components coming into another component that's going to then go to market. And when we think about that distribution channel and that procurement channel, we need to give the vendors credit that they actually have vetted their suppliers and those distribution channels, because they don't want a counterfeit product getting to market. And so we need to use their trusted channel partners, their value-added resellers, and or buy off of the vetted tables of GSA. And at the end of the year, because today's the 25th, although I think most procurement is shut down, there are some people who might have an extra $1,000 or $2,000 in their kitty to buy whatever product, and I'm talking about the government. And you may not want to go to GSA at this point because you can't actually secure the sale in the last 5 days of the fiscal year. And I can guarantee you, you will likely get a gray market or a counterfeit product if you go to eBay or you go to one of the non-trusted channels. Then we need to think about operation. We've got all of these products and all these components, and they're coming now into our enterprise and our infrastructure, and we're going to hope that it's all assembled in a good way, and there's no new vulnerabilities that have been introduced, that you've integrated all of these components. And now you're responsible. It's almost the end of the delivery part of whatever that trusted supplier was, and now you're going to have to operate it. Well, now operation requires that we actually follow, again, best practices and enforce information assurance policies. All of us want our 24/7 uptime of all of these things, but 24/7 uptime without having all of the security processes in place means that it's also available and accessible to anybody who might be able to penetrate that vulnerability. The consensus audit guidelines and other simple information assurance controls help manage or reduce that risk of operation. And that's an essential, actually, handoff of once we've delivered that product to market and we're going to operate it, we should operate it in what the industry says are the best ways to secure it and operate it. Then we need to maintain it. The next, as far as we're now on the sixth part of the supply chain life cycle, and maintaining means that we need to confirm the integrity of the network, and we need to continue to confirm the integrity of the network. Well, what does that mean? Well, sometimes we outsource the updates of those networks. Sometimes we have just automatic updates that it just happens, like Patch Tuesday. And so we need to think about ensuring that we have not automatically, through that patching or through the outsourcing of the maintenance, that we haven't inadvertently corrupted the enterprise. And so, again, we talk about supply chain integrity and managing the risk. The risk has a management structure along each of these aspects. And then finally, we're going to retire some part of that component. And oftentimes we're seeing for humanitarian purposes or for citizen services, we are actually handing over the used and older components, and we're giving them away to schools and or developing nations. Well, the information, while you may have thought it was erased, is usually still there on the computer. And those of you who are forensic experts in the audience and or online, you know that you can pretty much recover that. And so if you don't want your data exposed and you want to manage your risk, then you're likely going to have to melt down whatever is the component that stored your data. And so responsible retirement of the overall components is also part of supply chain risk management. Now, there are a number of mitigations that we can put in place, from the platforms to the software assurance to the preferred suppliers, preferred logistics, and independent certification that's mutually recognized by countries around the world. Those standard-based certifications are part of the assurance, or the part of the way that we manage the risk, whether that's the International Standards Organization, ISO, that's published many of the cybersecurity standards, including one set of standards that just came out about 6 weeks ago, to the Common Criteria certification that's mutually recognized by many countries around the world, and has labs where we can actually test the product before it gets integrated into our overall infrastructure and enterprise. So I'd like to kind of close with a few points. We need to recognize that this is a global ICT ecosystem that all of our countries are embracing and all of our companies are embedding into our infrastructures, because it promises GDP growth, it promises efficiency, it promises the productivity. That economic policy versus the security requirements needs to be balanced. We need to think about that those anchor tenants, the brand, that although they may be world-recognized leaders, does not mean that its efficacy, that the products are not without items or things that we need to be worried about. And so therefore we need to have a consumer reports-like rating system of these products and services, and consider that of just because A works with B doesn't mean it will work with C. And as we're rolling out the next generation product every 3 months, every 60 days, and we're embedding and integrating it into our system, and we're so enamored with what the product will bring as far as agility and efficiency, we need to actually start rating them of whether or not they're performing the way that we need them to perform, and whether or not they're introducing vulnerabilities into our enterprises that we find unacceptable. From a policy and technology perspective, we really do need a mix of market levers. Most of our countries and our governments, because they are responsible for the essential services and citizen safety, are trying to put control back into the system, and many of our countries are talking about regulation, a lot of regulation. Well, in many ways, if we really want to have adoption of a policy, and we're going to encourage that adoption of a policy, and we want to have that behavior change, we need to talk about changes also in providing incentives. And I'm going to give you an example. We have a policy in the United States that talks about that we want to have energy diversity and efficiency and limit the emissions into the environment. And that policy is then complemented by a whole series of subsidies and or tax relief and or credits, however you want to think about it, to encourage that policy. We, as citizens, get paid or get a tax credit, a write-off, of driving a fuel-efficient or an electric car, right? You get to go on the HUV, the high occupancy vehicle lanes with an electric car. It's an incentive to buy a fuel-efficient and or a car that meets the energy policy of the country. As citizens, we also get a tax write-off if we buy fuel-efficient windows and fuel-efficient heating and cooling systems. Businesses, like the Potomac Institute and others that are probably in the room today, they also get tax write-offs for buying and installing energy-efficient, fuel-efficient, lower emissions heating and cooling systems, windows, et cetera, in their businesses. And adopting more green policies and diversified energy policies. And then third, for those businesses and to try to encourage innovation, again, there's a 17% tax credit for research and development for new technologies in the energy and in this field. If we're going to get serious about cybersecurity, our policy and the market levers that we use needs to follow suit. And that we need to stop talking just about regulation, and we need to start talking about market incentives to get to that adoption. This requires partnership. We need to build a secure cyber society together. It requires a team. It requires us to meet regularly and understand what incentivizes both parties. One is about bottom line profit, innovation, and competitiveness in a global ICT market. The other is about national sovereignty, national security, and overall economic growth. It's time to bridge that conversation, and I thank the Potomac Institute for actually starting this conversation, because it's going to take time, money, and we need to reduce our exposure together. Thank you.
Melissa, thank you so much, and to all of our speakers, thank you so much. I feel like that we all should get some college credit for just attending this great class. So just a couple of notes as how this applies to the communications supply chain that I'll add just from my experience at the FCC. And it really plays into exactly what Melissa Hathaway was talking about, the levers, both policy levers and market levers. Now, the FCC is not an intelligence agency. As a matter of fact, while I was there, they said it had no intelligence at all. So I'm not speaking as to specific threats, but obviously with the communications infrastructure, we have to be concerned about the fact that it cuts across all the other critical infrastructures, the way energy and some others do. And consequently, so what are those thoughts? What are those threats? Well, if you are concerned about both software and hardware that is in our infrastructure, then there's a possibility for a lack of security, information leaking out, so to speak. Dr. Robert Hutchison at the Sandia Labs also talks about, and he tries to raise every time he speaks, a major concern about the integrity of our databases. So the fact someone getting in and actually changing ground truth is a major concern. You think about all the old movies where you say, well, I'm sorry, sir, you're dead. I said, no, I'm not. I said, no, I looked in your thing, you're actually dead. So actually getting in and altering databases is a major concern. And then there's the other, outright act of war kind of thing where you got a kill switch for your communications networks. So those are things that you can be concerned about. How do you protect against those? Well, we're talking about private infrastructure. And so there is perhaps a role for government, but you also have to be concerned about too heavy a role where you're actually diminishing the capabilities of private industry to protect itself, which it already has an incentive to do. So as Melissa said, you have to look at both the proper role for government and incentivizing the private industry. And what we're talking about right there is the very fact, the base bedrock fact is security costs money. Someone is paying for it. And so can government help in creating a market for it? Can they create incentives for that to add security to the system? One of the things, some of the different ideas that were kicked around while I was working on this, some people thought that perhaps the government should review the procurement of major carriers. Well, that may be a step too far in my role. That may be slow down the system, actually impede the private companies from doing it. But it is one of the things that's on the table. Another question is kind of the buying power, and I think Brett Lambert referred to this, is if the government insists in its contracts on certain things that secure the supply chain, perhaps that is a way to encourage it. But as he mentioned, well, perhaps that's diminishing now as we have moved over these past decades toward more commercial off-the-shelf technology. And perhaps another one, and this is one of the ones that we had put together a paper on at the FCC, perhaps a tiered systems of supply chain risk management. Understanding that not every piece of equipment can be regulated by the government or necessarily protected by industry, but maybe you need to concentrate on those areas that are most important. So for instance, in our communication networks, the control layer, there's a piece of equipment called the signaling transfer point, STP. like a lot of equipment right now, it's got a way back to its home company. That may be, if it's in the United States, it could be someplace else too, where continually update. And yet, if you take out an STP, you've taken out the network. So perhaps STPs and things in the control layer almost need to have the same type of protection that you would for the avionics of an F-15. Maybe that's the thing. And then as you move down from there in tiered system, maybe you can use best practices. Maybe you can use standards of supply chain management that would allow things. And at the lower tier, it's pretty much maybe just best practices or the companies thinking good things. But we have to understand anything that's done in this area costs money. So with that kind of overview, I'd like to move now to some questions to our panel, and then I'm going to open it up for your questions in just a little while. And in this regard, since there was this discussion, but I'd like to start with the question of trusted suppliers and what role trusted suppliers may be able to make in this. So, Brad, maybe each one of them hinted at this, but let me open it up to you in each of the panels. What do you mean by trusted supplier? What are the implications and ramifications, and is this a policy that we should continue or should pursue? Yeah, Brett, you brought it up first.
Well, you know, there are roles for all three, I think, of the elements you described and ways you can attack the problem. I think the issue we find ourselves in, particularly in government, is we try to find very bumper sticker-like solutions to very complex problems, and so there is a tendency to gravitate toward a solution that is easily understood by not just the customer, but by the legislation that would the legislators who would have to pass it and the contract officers who would have to impose it. That leads you then to building fences around things because that's the easy solution. You can do that, and in some cases that is a necessary approach, I think, particularly when there aren't unique commercial opportunities or things you could do with industry standards. So like you said, a more tiered system. My references to trusted foundries is they are a very good solution for some things, but it's a very narrow, very, very specific set of challenges for very unique products that the government faces. It's a very expensive solution, you could pursue that. You could pursue it for a wider range of things. You would find yourself probably several billions of dollars later, in several years down the road, being able to manufacture a perfect 886 chip. But so one of the difficulties of fencing things is you lose the access to the innovation and the commercial technology. So there has to be a balance, and trusted suppliers are certainly one of them. I think something that's lost often in this conversation is that the motivations of the other side, and when I say other side, who is on the supply chain, who's causing the problems. And the vast majority of I would say a vast majority, not the vast results, but the vast majority of this is really criminal behavior in many cases in the supply chain. These are people that are doing this for profit. And that's what I would call the yellow tape issue. That's where you need aggressive prosecution. You need to differentiate suppliers who behave in this manner, make sure they don't supply particularly to the U.S. government or through our prime contractors. But that's really a criminal. That's a yellow tape issue. The more complex issues are those who are trying to attempt to enter the supply chain for nefarious purposes, either for failure or exfiltration. And that's where I think our main challenges that we face. And you're going to have to come up with different solutions to each unique problem. It's just not going to be a one-size-fits-all, no matter how much we would like it to be. You can't take an example, for instance, of a successful program in the Department of Defense for managing the supply chain, and then all of a sudden decide that you're going to apply that single solution to everything the Department of Defense buys. We just simply would not be able to buy anything if that were the case.
Melissa, Dennis?
I think the only level that I'd add is it's not just, I think, trust in suppliers of objects or things, but also, as Melissa was referring to in her talk, those who support those things, the trust in those who might install them or maintain them as well.
Mm-hmm. And Melissa, did you have anything?
When I think about I think we're talking about multiple definitions of a trusted supplier. And so if you look at it from a business point of view, many of their suppliers have to go through a set of requirements that meet whatever the security and or brand integrity of the overall company. Whether it's the background investigation that companies have to go through for, to supply to other companies, to meeting all of the legal requirements. For example, the Corruption Act or OSHA standards. I mean, there's all sorts of standards, and I'm just citing some of the ones that are in the United States. Suppliers have to meet with and meet the requirements of many different countries' laws. And sometimes it's difficult to become a supplier to a high brand name marker, anchor tenant, because they don't want to have their brand integrity challenged or their product challenged, and they're trying to deliver the best product to market at the best price point possible to get more market share and more global dominance. So I think that, when we talk about trusted supplier to the government, that's one set of vetting, and then there's trusted suppliers to the suppliers, and that's another set of vetting, and those two processes are both very important.
Food analogies are some of my most favorite. When as Dennis was speaking with his food analogy, I was thinking I'm Mississippi, in case you couldn't tell from my accent. And I love catfish. And these days when you're eating catfish, you don't know if it came from the Mississippi Delta or Vietnam. And our food source is truly global. But with that, extending that food analogy just a little bit further, we do have a Food and Drug Administration. We have the United States Department of Agriculture that has regulations. And so, Dennis, to extend your analogy, I mean, is there a role for regulation in cyberspace? What are the proper roles? And as Melissa mentioned, policy levers. I will put to you and to each of our panelists.
Well, to start off, Jim, as I said at the opening remarks, we don't actually, as NSA, set or make policy. So whether or not there's a role for regulation or other methodologies is really up for others in our government to decide. With that said, right, one having to have some set of standards, however that is, that folks can know what good is, right, and what is the mark to shoot for, seems to us to be really important. Now, how one takes those standards and either incentivize or moves to make progress in there is the subject that's really up for a lot of discussion and debate right now.
Okay. Brett, Melissa?
No, I just say I didn't realize catfish could swim that far from Vietnam. But I think you're right. There has to be a combination of incentives, but also, a combination of levers. It's like anything else in business, and the more we can assist in crafting the commercial standards which tend to drive the technology edge, and then applique those when they're appropriate. I think it's a more appropriate lever than trying to come up with our own, where we may find ourselves coming up with great standards, but alienating the very technological edge we're seeking to obtain.
Melissa?
When I wrote down Upton Sinclair, and so so perhaps it requires somebody to expose what's going on in order for all of the different behavior changes to happen. So we're looking for the Upton Sinclair of cybersecurity.
It's a jungle. It really is. Yes. So one of the things that has come up during your discussions here are the question of counterfeit chips, and there have been some fairly high-level, open source concerns about gray market components and chips showing up in places that they shouldn't, and implications. So, what would you say the mechanisms are that they're putting in place to limit counterfeit products from reaching the marketplace and therefore reaching our critical infrastructure?
Well, this is not my purview. We have an entire operation. I think in the Pentagon, when you wanted to get a lot of people at meetings 10 years ago, you used the word transformation. And 5 years ago, you used the word cyber, and now you use the word supply chain. And it's amazing how many people are interested in it these days. But there's a whole group of individuals at DoD and within each of the services who are looking specifically at that question. I tend to look at it, my portfolio is more from the industrial base, how the decisions that we arrive at, how we interact with the industrial base. But it's a very serious challenge, and I can tell you that the supply chain folks under OSD and within each of the services are actively looking at it to try to come up with these not one-size-fits-all solutions, but try to come up with something that is not just appropriate for today, but is scalable and flexible enough that it will be appropriate in 5 to 10 years. And I'd be happy to put people in touch with the task forces and the leadership if you're interested in knowing more about them. But there's a lot of aggressive work going on right now.
Other comments? Melissa? Not that one?
Not on chips.
Okay. We talked about authorities and some of the things that the various levers that we might have out there. We've talked about gray market and those types of things. Are there things that the government could do? Is there a way through procurement that we could influence things? And Brett, you mentioned ways to get people to meetings by using buzzwords. There's a buzzword, a set of buzzwords that people have run through. If you wanted people to run, all you had to do in the past is say industrial policy. But is there a place for industrial policy? I mean, we don't. In the communications industry, there's a great deal of our, I guess you'd say, mechanisms, all of it that goes with it that's done someplace other than the United States, and even those companies that you would typically call American, they have things built all over the world, as Melissa said. Is there a place for an industrial policy, and is there a place for regulation?
Well, I think the market tends to work pretty well. I'd echo what Melissa said. The market does tend to be, in many cases, self-correcting. We can't always wait around for it to self-correct without some incentives, and I think that's what we're trying to apply. Industrial policy has the connotation of imposing some onerous and objectionable standards upon the industry, and I think we're trying to do exactly the opposite. We're trying to come up with a reasonable approach where we work with the industrial base and the supply chain, first of all, to better understand them and what the issues they uniquely face, and then figure out what levers we have in the government, whether they be on the incentive side and tax credits, what we could help apply to make U.S., particularly U.S. companies, more competitive internationally. We have a lot of vehicles to do that. The Defense Production Act is one, manufacturing technology programs, both of which fall under my purview, but then there's a whole host of other ones. So we're really looking at incentives, not disincentives. My personal opinion is that strict regulations and restrictions when you talk about technologies never really work over the long period. They're short-term fixes, but then you end up, again, with a perfect 886 chip in this context. So I think there's a balance there. There is an appropriate role for government to play, but I think it's most appropriate when government can work with international standards organizations and people that are really driving the technology side of things, and then focus what's truly unique about our products and that we need.
Thanks, Melissa.
I mean, I think, as I said, that we need to have a mix of the different market levers, whether it's regulation or it's incentive-based, and oftentimes you need both. But you need to think about that it's almost like throwing a stone in the pond, and there'll be a ripple effect. In many ways, the United States began this conversation about supply chain integrity about 5 years ago, because I was one of the people who did it. And it never, I think, occurred to anybody that it would have such a ripple effect around the world, where so many countries would begin talking about that would only be indigenous manufacturing, indigenous suppliers, and not just for their national security systems, but their telecommunication systems and the like. And now you're starting to see that ripple effect actually hurt the competitiveness of the major ICT companies, many of which are in the United States. It's starting to hurt the overall market of innovation and the next generation products, because now we're just looking at certain innovation areas it's going to be indigenous, and so you only have the best ideas of your country. But the internet actually evolved, and many of the technological innovations evolved from multiple countries. Somebody came up with the idea of X, and then it was modified in Japan, it was modified in Finland, it was modified around the world. Somebody developed another product, and then it was modified and or enhanced and improved, and countries all around the world participated in this overall internet revolution and evolution. And so as we look at the mix of levers that we're going to use in order to get to whatever our policy is or wants to be, then we really need to think about the unintended consequences of whatever decision that the United States leads with, because many look to the United States as the leader in the discussion of this particular area.
And I would add that no matter what levers are decided to be used, it's always important to sit back and reflect a bit on the context of why we're even having the conversation, that our dependency on this space, cyberspace, is significant, and the threat that we face as a nation is real, growing, and evolving. Evolving in the sense that it started out in a way of theft, right? We might call it espionage, intellectual property theft, an evolution to disruption, keeping others from being able to access the services that they might want to. And our real concern and fear as a nation that it could evolve past that, possibly to destruction. So whatever the levers are used, it's in the context of knowing that this, with our dependency, is a real important area for us to work, and that it's not a hypothetical threat, it's a threat that's real and growing and evolving that we're going to have to together address.
And so Melissa mentioned some of those levers, and that perhaps they are both on the regulatory and the market side. I mean, are there authorities right now for doing that type of regulation? Do they exist right now, or is this something that would take legislation?
We have many regulators in the United States, of which have authorities that could address parts of these problems. We have the Federal Communications Commission, Jamie, and the authorities there that you used to advise the commissioners on to help bring about a standard of care within the telecommunications market. And if they were so bold, they could extend it to the internet service providers. The Federal Energy Regulatory Commission has the ability to ask for, along with states' blessing, standards of care within the electric utilities sector. And I stress that there's twofold regulators there, and not many people appreciate that there is price fixing to ensure that we have states help set the price point so that we get electricity that we can afford, and then the federal regulators impose another set of standards that must be met. And that twofold regulatory process exists in other countries in the world, but it's quite profound here in the United States. And so the FERC authorities are not necessarily as strong as the state authorities when it comes to the electric utility sector. The nuclear sector is also regulated, and they do have a very strict regulation when it comes to cybersecurity, and so we can learn from what they've done well and how that might be hurting the industry. All publicly held companies are also regulated through the Securities and Exchange Commission, and as we all know, cybersecurity is now a hot topic within the SEC, and they've announced some proposed dialogue on standards of care within publicly held companies. The financial services sector is also generally regulated, and so is the credit card sector through compliance. And so there are regulators that could need to learn more about the threat of what's at stake, and then work with industry so that we can get to a better ability to deliver essential services, manage that risk, and reduce the vulnerabilities.
I think that work with industry is a key point. Brett or Dennis? Okay, at this point, I'd like to open it up to our audience here. And what I would ask is that you raise your hand, and Pat Cheatham, our research assistant, will bring you a, okay, so Randy Fort's already coming up here right now. But if you would state your name and organization if you'd like to, and then your question. Randy?
Thanks, Jamie. Randy Fort with Raytheon. Mr. Lambert, one of the standard constructs at the Department of Defense is RDT&E, Research, Development, Test, and Evaluation. I'd like to focus on the T&E part of this and whether or not that may be one of the solution sets. That is, to test and evaluate the different products in the supply chain to see if they are cyber resilient, cyber secure, and to evaluate or to measure exactly how much. So just be interested in your comments, whether we could take what has been a decades-long construct in terms of DoD thinking and practice, and is that something that could be extended to the cyber supply chain to come up with the testing models, the testing infrastructure, and so forth that would give us better insight and understanding into the vulnerabilities, the resilience of the various systems. Thank you.
Again, the RTD&E or the R&E side that Zach Limnios runs works on this as well as the T&E side in the department. And in fact, they already do this in many of them. But it goes back to what I'd said earlier, that is a very effective, it can be a very effective mitigation tool for what is in essence criminal behavior, where things are being introduced that aren't true parts or are somehow reconditioned parts or whatnot. It's more difficult when you get into items where you may have to do destructive testing, because of course you can't do destructive testing on everything, and so it has to be more of a sampling issue. But certainly, you know, one of the things, we're not trying to start from scratch. We're trying to look throughout the department, and this is part of the task forces that are going on, look throughout the department on those areas, T&E being one of the key ones, as well as some of the other acceptance criteria that go on now with our systems, and how we could better leverage them, either by doing additional testing or by requesting or requiring more upfront information before that comes into thing. And that solves a large portion of it. It may address even a large portion of the yellow tape thing I had mentioned earlier. But even there, you still have the more fundamental and frankly the much more serious in terms of the vulnerabilities of those actors that may be introducing elements that are very difficult to catch through regular T&E or any other delivery kind of criteria that we currently use.
Dennis?
Just to add on to what Jim said, talked about some of the attributes of cyberspace at the beginning, and one of them was continual change. So agreeing with a role of test and evaluation, we also have to put that in the context that cyberspace is continually changing, as are the objects or things that it's made up of. So you may test and evaluate at one moment, but with upgrades, changes, as was mentioned by Melissa on the Cyber Update Tuesdays or whatever, the devices themselves are often morphing and changing substantially. So one has to factor that into the discussion as well.
I think there was one over here, behind the stanchion to me.
Hi, I'm Sidney Friedberg from AOL Defense, hiding behind the pillar here. A twofold question. One is, you know, obviously there's been a lot of talk about counterfeit parts and so forth, a lot of concern about that. You know, how many cases and how severe the cases have we actually had to date where, you know, there was a chip that was calling home as it were, to some nefarious actor, or is it not simply a matter of it's counterfeit, but it's actually, represents that malign threat that's either actively spying or, sitting there as a potential kill switch for us to disrupt or destruct a system. To the extent you can talk about that in open forum. And the second question, as we look to fix this, we heard a lot of talk about incentives, but what would those specific incentives be? What are the models from other sectors, perhaps, of how you actually make it appealing for people to address these problems, as opposed to just, using the stick of regulation? Thanks.
I think there have been some public comments on hearings on your first question, but without knowing specifically what the public comments have, I'll take a pass on it. But there are certainly we've seen instances, but I couldn't get into the numbers or the specifics, unless you want to. And I think actually you're probably better to ask on the incentives portion of the question. I mean, what do you see as the levers that we could use other than just, I think you have a better perspective.
Incentives. So I'm going to call back to the energy policy. And we had a mix of incentives. So you need to create sort of the demand curve or the market adoption. And so first, I would look at an individual tax credit of X number of dollars for encouraging every household to have either a managed security service that they buy from their internet service provider, but it's subsidized through a tax credit. Or if you want to take it down to a point solution, which I wouldn't recommend, you could have antivirus software as a write-off. That if you keep that up to date and whatever your subscription rate is, I think personally bringing it up to an ISP is probably a smarter thing to do because you get it at the upstream and not at the downstream of your entity or your endpoint. For businesses, again, have the internet service providers providing more of a managed security service to all of the infrastructures and have that be some type of a tax write-off. I would extend the 17% R&D credit to the ICT industry for the innovation of the product, so the next generation product that has less vulnerabilities in it, that uses a secure development life cycle, that has all of the assurances in place from beginning, design, to end of retirement for those product lines, and so that you're building more secure products, services, et cetera, from start to finish. And then you're going to get a better ecosystem somewhere down the line, whether that's 3 years from now or 5 years from now. You're going to have more secure products hitting the market, and therefore you're going to reduce your exposure in the long term by the policy and the incentives. If you want to take on more of an industrial policy, and I've written about it and we're using this, is we could in fact start to declare our ICT industry and the internet environment as an essential industry to the growth and health of the United States of America, like we've done for our defense industrial base. We subsidize parts of our industrial base. We ensure that we're going to buy X amount from our industrial base in order because they are a critical supplier to the overall national security and economic health of the nation. So we could leverage the Defense Production Act and other levers that we have in order to make sure that we have the product and services coming from an essential industry that is actually driving our GDP growth and is one of our largest export industries in the world, that it might be important for us to consider those other levers of incentives to ensure the health and well-being of that sector that's driving the overall growth and well-being of our country.
And I'd just add, along those lines, you're exactly right. And 2 years ago, we set up under the Defense Production Act something called Congress. It was very helpful in this, the Defense Production Act Committee, and that is actually a committee of all the deputies of all the agencies, 17 different departments that meet. We have teams that have been formed, and we're actually funding programs that are cross-government programs, but also more importantly, frankly, are their very vital programs to the future of national economic well-being. And one of the teams, there are 3 currently set up. One is on energy, one is on metal, and the third is on telecommunications. And the telecommunications team has probably been the most active And we are also pursuing, again, as part of a wider U.S. government effort, the NNMI programs. One was recently announced in Youngstown to create centers of excellence that are working with companies in the private sector as well as universities, with the government doing a one-to-one, a minimum one-to-one match. And we're developing these really centers of excellence, somewhat based on the Fraunhofer Institutes, if you know them. And I would expect in the coming months to see one dedicated, or to see a pursuit of one dedicated toward advanced telecommunications equipment, which we've identified in the Defense Production Act committees, working in the working group as vital to the future, not just of the U.S. national security, but U.S. economic well-being as well.
Great. Pat, oops, sorry, this gentleman over here, and then the lady in the light jacket.
Marcus Lasarchuk, Institute for Defense Analyses. I'd like to follow up on your food analysis. I like the analogy. If I go to a food chain and eat a sandwich and get ill from it because they did not exercise a proper standard of care, I have a legal recourse. When a company that gathers data about me is penetrated, my identity is compromised, I have to spend money and time on my own with no legal recourse against the company hoarding that data. What is your position on providing a legal avenue as an incentive for companies to raise the bar that security now is not a cost, it's a protection from legal liability?
That would be on the stick side of the carrot stick incentives there.
That stick exists in the federal, FTC, Federal Trade Commission. And they are actually now using their authorities to help protect your identity and or prosecute the companies that don't protect your identity and have a stated policy on those breaches. The FTC, if you're not witting of what their authorities are, they're responsible for protecting us in our e-commerce and all things that go along with e-commerce. And if your company, if LinkedIn, Yahoo picked the breach, had a stated policy that they were protecting these things, and most of these fall under the laws of the states currently of the Data Breach Acts of 47 of the U.S. states and territories, then they have to protect it. And so the FTC has just recently prosecuted Wyndham Hotels for the breach that they had for losing your credit cards and your identities. The Google just settled a lawsuit with the FTC. And many others. So FTC is coming and starting to use their authorities to protect e-commerce and us and our privacy, our data, and that lever exists. And I think you're going to start to see industry change the way that they're going about handling our data in the future.
Do you think there's a place for a private right of action? Or is the FTC enough?
There are class action suits. The most recent breach, I think eHarmony there's a class action suit for the mishandling of the data from that breach just about a month and a half ago. And so you're seeing the courts starting to weigh in from both the citizen right and then the FTC weighing in from holding businesses responsible.
Lady up here in a light jacket.
Hi, I'm Gwetta Mazzetti. I co-chaired the Defense Science Board Energy Security Task Force with Jim Woolsey and Jim Schlesinger, and I've just been named the technical co-chairman of the Chief of Naval Operations OCONUS Vulnerability on Energy Security. And I'd like to talk about SIP, but first of all, I'd like to take the opportunity to just say that the states and FERC on electricity and energy regulation, the states regulate almost exclusively for rates, not for reliability at all. And FERC regulations they can take effect after a process that takes 4 to 6 years. So in light of the rate of threat, which is something else I wanted to talk about, we have no effective regulatory system. So I'm particularly concerned about SIP, and I'm particularly concerned about cyber. And I would like to call into question the perishability of cyber solutions. A lot of the discussion today, which I completely agree with all of it, focused on the cyber solutions to the cyber problems. But I would like to point out that because of the rate of the threat, particularly with the bad actors, we might think about dumb solutions, and I wanted your thoughts on this, such as spare parts and the ability to take things completely down off of cyber, and talk about non-cyber solutions to the problem, workarounds, diversity of suppliers, that kind of thing.
Well, I mean, you're right. I won't comment on the energy. I'm not familiar with the energy side, but certainly there has to be a diversity of responses. And I'm fond of former Deputy Secretary Lynn had a saying that this is a classic asymmetric threat. Only in this case, we're spending billions of dollars against it could be half a dozen guys in a garage with wearing flip-flops with a bunch of Red Bull. I mean, it is a very difficult threat, and it's always changing. And how to get your arms around it is very difficult. And our solutions can't be monostatic as either; they have to be dynamic. And I think there are some capabilities that lend themselves to, frankly, disposability of systems. That's not something the department typically does. When we buy something, we would like to design it, procure it, and then keep it for 30 years. And that really is not a model for the future unless you're on water, sailing a big ship. And even there, what you put on that ship is going to have to change. So I think there's room for, and there is a dialogue along that, everything from disposability to resiliency to duplication. And I wouldn't, particularly in the IT world, I wouldn't dismiss the fact that since we do tend to be the tail more than the dog. One aspect of this is not to try to control the space, but to get lost in it. And that is a solution that's quite adequate for many of our systems. If components are so ubiquitous, then why would you want to point out that you had to have a specialized one? And so I think there's a range of both policy and technical solutions that need to be pursued, and we are looking at that entire spectrum.
Anybody else on that one?
I think there's two words that which you had started saying about physical and virtual or cyberspace being solutions maybe not just for one or for the other. The convergence that I talked about at the beginning is not just applying in the space we call cyberspace alone. That convergence is happening between the physical and the virtual worlds simultaneously. So therefore, solutions in the space understandably often have to have components in both the physical and the virtual world to be effective based on experience that we've seen. And in part, when you have a virtual world, it is, in fact, virtual, created. So anything you change in that space can actually be rechanged or unchanged or done. So permanency of change in cyberspace, while change is always going, the permanency of any change you make is short-lived, right? Because the space can be remorphed, created, and adjusted, which makes it even more important to be looking at both the physical and the virtual dimensions of problems all the time.
All right, over here.
Pat Sullivan, independent consultant. I haven't heard anybody explicitly refer to cloud computing today. Is that considered to be a solved problem, or what levers need to be put in place for that? Thank you.
Anybody else?
I look at clouds from both sides now. I had before, but there's so many. You could have an entire session, I think, just on cloud computing, both the opportunities and the vulnerabilities. And there are a lot of smart people working at it. And fortunately for us, they're mostly in your domain.
So I would say that cloud computing, not necessarily to say a solved problem in that everyone knows exactly what to do with it and therefore issue done. But if I take your question one more step further is, what about security in cloud computing? It's a good opportunity to make what I think is an important observation. We've typically looked at security as an add-on to what it is that we're doing, such that we have the cost for doing whatever we're doing in information technology or information and communications technology, and then there's this added cost to do security. What I think excites us with cloud computing is that we're at a stage of this right now where we can together, right, the industry and all, architect a solution for which the security is already in it. Melissa pointed back to a great thing that started happening back in 1969 with that first message. We didn't have the same context as a nation or individuals in security at that time. So now when we're working on these new technologies, we certainly can. Right? And so therefore, if we can, it may not be unachievable for us to actually reduce overall costs, because we don't have to have additive costs for security if we're actually designing effectively so that we can actually decrease our overall IT costs with greater security. And that's something that we believe be achievable if we're working to integrate both what is our requirements collectively for what kind of performance we want out of these systems with security right from the beginning.
So I know there are other questions, but I know that our panelists, some have to dash after this, but I would say I would stay all afternoon because I'm just fascinated listening to you. I've learned a great deal, and I particularly enjoyed the interaction between a very knowledgeable audience and a very knowledgeable panel. But would you join me in thanking our panel for this great talk? And General McFalls, it's been great hosting this with National Security Partners. Any comments or?
We're looking for the next one.
Absolutely. We hope everybody will come back for that. And now for closing comments, I'd like to introduce our CEO, Mike Swetnam.
I'd like to add my congratulations on a good event to the staff here at Potomac Institute who's put it on, and the warmest possible thanks to our panel for taking the time to come and help us kick off this conversation. Hopefully in the long run we can turn it into something that's of benefit to you, and that is our goal. About the only most gratifying part of being the CEO of the Potomac Institute is it's the only part of my life where I get to have the last word, at least for a few minutes. And so I want to have lay out two thoughts in parting today very quickly that occurred to me as I listened to the presentations today. The first I would just call everything. Complex problems, and we're more and more dealing with problems that have such complexity to them that they don't lend themselves to easy solutions, just as Brett mentioned a little bit earlier. This clearly is one of the most complex problems that ever faced mankind, brought on by one of the best technologies that we've ever invented, the internet and communications technology. Clearly, no single answer, however grand and wonderful, is going to address it. So when you hear comments about trusted foundry or this or that doesn't address the problem, the answer is never no. The answer is yes and. We need that and this and everything else we can think of. And the only problem with that is it's going to cost a fortune. Yes, it's going to cost an awful lot of money. But what is it worth? Almost going on 11 years ago, it was 9 years and a month ago, we had 3,000 people die because an airplane ran into a building. And RAND just completed a study that was published a month ago that says we're spending, the federal government, not the additional cost in industry, this federal government in various forms is spending $6.5 billion a year to just secure air travel. That's a small, minuscule problem compared to the cyber thing, and we're spending $6 billion a year. At some point, we're going to realize that securing the cyber infrastructure is worth the enormous cost that it's going to cost us. It's going to cost an awful lot of money. The final thought is the role of business and government. We'll go back and forth on that, and the Potomac Institute has a B and G in it, especially technology policy from government to industry. And there's a lot of discussion about the federal government shouldn't be involved in this type of thing, whether it's setting policy or enacting it or operating things, because the commercial sector will, of course, do it much better and more efficiently. Almost always true, but it's also often true that industry won't do it until the government first sets the policy and the standard and does it poorly. Then we figure out industry can do it better, we buy it from them. So remember also that just because industry will do it better doesn't mean that we shouldn't in government do it first. With that, those minor thoughts, thank you very much for coming. And remember, this is just the beginning of the discussion, the beginning of the search for the answer, not the end. So your continued efforts and thoughts and input is most important. Thank you all very much for coming.
That's great. I learned a lot from you guys. Thanks so much.
I really like the structures you were saying in the opening comment.